and welcome to the second session by Professor Tayfun Sonmez. Welcome, sir. We are really delighted to have you. So, Professor Sonmez is Professor of Economics at Boston College, and we had a very enlightening talk in the morning on affirmative action in India by him. And this talk, which we are going to have right now, is on mechanism design. And he's going to tell us more about redesigning the US Army's branching process. So we really look forward to this talk, sir. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Okay, everything is visible, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, it's been a long day for most of you, so thank you for those who are still here. I will continue with the same theme, real-life mechanism design. And this talk is about redesigning the US Army's cadet branch matching process. It is joint work with Carl Grimberg, who is at United States Military Academy at West Point, and Parag Pathak at MIT. Each year, the US Army assigns thousands of graduating cadets from the United States Military Academy, USMA, at West Point, and the Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC, to their first job in a military occupation or branch through centralized systems. Branch assignment is highly consequential for career progression in the Army. Prior to the class of 2006, cadets were assigned positions at Army branches using a serial dictatorship that is induced by a cadet performance ranking known as the Order of Merit List, or OML. Under this mechanism, cadets submit their preferences over the set of branches, and the highest Order of Merit List cadet is assigned to her most preferred branch. The second highest OML cadet is assigned to her most preferred branch among remaining branches, among branches with remaining positions, and so on and so forth. In response to declining junior officer retention rates during the late 1990s, and early 2000s, starting with 2006, the Army offered a menu of retention incentives to cadets at USMA and ROTC. The most popular incentive, which involved the reform of branching mechanism, was the Branch of Choice program, also called the BRATSO program. Under this program, cadets are given higher priority for a fraction of positions at any given branch if they indicate willingness to extend their active duty service obligation, ADSO, by 3 years at that branch. So this is the mandatory obligation after you graduate. We sometimes refer ADSO as the price because it is the time cost on you. The strategy space of the new mechanism was also expanded by requesting cadets to report the set of branches for which they are willing to pay the increased price in exchange for receiving increased priority at a fraction of its positions. So prior to this reform, cadets were just ranking branches. Now they are ranking branches and also picking a subset of branches, possibly empty, to be interpreted as those branches where cadets are willing to pay the price to receive favorable treatment in a fraction of positions. Under the USMA 2006 mechanism, the branch assignments are made through a process that resembles the previous OML-induced serial dictatorship, with one important exception. Once the regular base price positions are filled at any branch, cadets who indicated willingness to pay the increased price are given priority for the remaining flexible price positions. The ADSO charges are determined subsequently as follows. Cadets who receive a regular position are charged the regular price. Cadets who receive a flexible price position are charged the regular price if they have not indicated willingness to pay the increased price for their assigned branch, and the increased price if they did indicate willingness to pay the increased price for their assigned branch. Two aspects of this mechanism are not ideal. First of all, cadets are asked whether they are willing to pay the increased price at a branch or not, independent of what the alternative would be. For example, a cadet is not able to indicate he is willing to pay the increased price to receive a position at his first choice branch if the alternative is receiving a position at his third or lower choice branches, but not if the alternative is receiving a position at his second choice branch. So that's the first problem. The second problem is cadets who indicate willingness to pay the increased price for a branch are charged the increased price upon receiving one of its flexible price positions, even if they would have received the same position at regular price if they weren't willing to pay the increased price. Okay, so these aspects in turn result in a number of shortcomings of the USMA 2006 mechanism, including the following two issues. Okay, so first of all, there can be detectable priority reversal. So what's that? A cadet may receive a position at increased price while a lower order of merit list cadet receives a position at the same branch at regular price. Okay, so basically somebody with lower performance than me, lower ranking than me, is receiving the same branch cheaper. So that we call detectable priority reversal. Another issue is failure of incentive compatibility. A cadet may benefit from hiding her willingness to pay the increased price that we refer to as failure of Brazzo IC, or from misrepresenting her branch preferences. As a remedy, in an earlier paper in Sonmez and Swisher 2013, we propose an alternative mechanism for the USMA based on Hatfield and Migram's celebrated cumulative offer mechanism. Our proposal was built on the fundamental research on matching with contracts by Hatfield and Migram 2005, and it's very important extension by Hatfield and Kojima 2010. The proposed mechanism is a direct mechanism where cadets submit their preferences over branch price pairs, rather than just branches and sending a signal. The Army initially viewed this strategy space to be too complex and decided to maintain the USMA 2006 mechanism. Adoption of a mechanism with a more involved strategy space was initially seen at the Army as unnecessary due to three main reasons. First of all, Brazzo IC failures and detectable priority reversals have been rare in practice. Second, any Brazzo IC failure or detectable priority reversal can be manually corrected ex post, since each incidence only involves a cadet needlessly paying the increased price at her assigned branch. And third, while there can be additional priority reversals that cannot be manually corrected ex post, their verification relies on cadet preferences over branch price pairs, and information that is unavailable under the existing USMA 2006 strategy space. In summary, any failure of the USMA 2006 mechanism can either be manually corrected ex post or cannot be verified with existing data. In 2012, Army introduced a second program called Talent-Based Branching to develop a talent market where additional information about each cadet influences the priority a cadet receives at a branch. Under the TBB program, branches rate cadets into one of three tiers: high, medium, and low. For several years, these ratings remained a pilot initiative. For the class of 2020, the Army decided to integrate them into the branching process, constructing priorities at each branch, first by the tier and then by the OML within the tier. Brazzo policy was also changed. Cadets willing to pay the increased price now received higher priority within their tiers only, not compared to every cadet. Since the decision to integrate cadet ratings into branch process took under an abbreviated timeline, the Army maintained the same strategy space for the new mechanism as in previous years. Using an adjusted priority order of cadets that takes both TBB ratings and increased price willingness into consideration, the new mechanism used the cadet proposing deferred acceptance algorithm by Gale and Shapley to determine the branch assignments. The price was then determined subsequently as follows: subject to a maximum of the number of flexible price positions at any given branch and following the reverse priority order of the branch, cadets who indicated willingness to pay the increased price at their assigned branch are charged the increased price, and the remaining cadets who are matched are charged the regular price. In addition to inheriting the limitations of the previous mechanism, the following aspect of the USMA 2020 mechanism added new challenges. First of all, even though the number of flexible price positions was kept at 25% of the total capacity at each branch, priority upgrading due to increased price willingness was applied for all its positions. This design choice made it possible to use the vanilla version of the cadet proposing deferred acceptance algorithm, but it also introduced a new type of incentive compatibility failure we call strategic Brazzo. Loosely speaking, this strategic issue is the opposite of what you see in the Brazzo IC. Whereas indicating willingness to pay the increased price could hurt cadets due to Brazzo IC failures, now it could also profit them with a costless priority upgrade due to strategic Brazzo. The end result was a mechanism that is highly complex to participate in and one with more widespread failures, including priority reversals that cannot be manually corrected ex post. Before a formal analysis was carried out by our team, the USMA leadership already recognized the possibility of detectable priority reversals under the USMA 2020 mechanism due to either failure of Brazzo IC or presence of strategic Brazzo. A major concern emerged as an erosion of cadets' trust in the Army's branching process due to failure of Brazzo IC, possibility of strategic Brazzo, or presence of detectable priority reversals, especially when they are not manually corrected ex post. To address these types of concerns, the USMA leadership decided to execute a dry run of the USMA 2020 mechanism to inform cadets of the potential cutoffs for each branch. As emphasized in the following quote, from a September 2019 US Army News article, the goal of the dry run was to improve transparency and help cadets to optimize their submitted strategies. We are going to tell all the cadets, we are going to show all of them, here is when the branch would have went out, here's the bucket you are in, here's the branch you would have received if this were for real. You have 6 days to go ahead and redo your preferences and look at if you want to browse or not, Sonsdal said. I think it's good to be transparent. I just don't know what 21-year-olds will do with that information. So as you see, the same quote at the end also indicates that USMA leadership recognized the challenges in cadets optimizing their strategies under the USMA 2020 mechanism. So just to give a sense of whether the dry run was helpful or not, here we have the number of failures, and these are the actual number of failures under the dry run and the actual run of USMA 2020 mechanism. There are about 1,000 cadets at USMA. As you see, the dry run actually helped. In the actual run, the issues decreased maybe about by half, but compared to previous years' averages, it more than quadrupled. So on the left panel, now we have the failures in the previous mechanism, and the failures now includes more dramatic failures, those which cannot be corrected, which are associated with this red one, and also with some of the, the difference between the blue bar and this the brown bar is those priority reversals which cannot be reversed. So it was still, there was still significant increase compared to previous years, including bigger issues. To resolve the problems with the branching system, the Army established a partnership with myself and Parag Patak for a redesign of their mechanism, with Greenberg leading the reform efforts at USMA. Critical to achieving these objectives was the Army's decision to permit cadets in the class of 2021 to submit preferences over branch price pairs, rather than cadets just ranking the branches and sending, also picking a subset of branches. This decision was aided by the evidence from a cadet survey that mitigated concerns that ranking branch price pairs would be overly complex or unnecessary. Remember that close to a decade ago, when I proposed a reform, much of the reason, the big reason it really didn't go through was, or one of the big reasons was, the strategy space was evaluated to be just too complex and not worth the benefit. So now with the increased failures and having bigger issues, the Army reevaluated their position. And indeed, some of the demand for this kind of change come from the cadets. Indeed, some of the cadets indicated the need for a system that would allow them to rank order branch price pairs. For example, one cadet wrote in a survey, "I believe that Department of Military Instruction could elicit a new type of ranking list. Within my proposed system, people could add to the list of 17 branches, Brazos slots, and rank them within that list. For example, aviation better than infantry, better than aviation with Brazzo. While this may be a transmutation of an alternate system, I believe many cadets could utilize this system, as it is the case that people view branch without ADSO and Brazzo slots are considered almost different things. So the last sentence is not ideal, but I think what the cadet meant is pretty straightforward. So in the rest of my talk, just like yesterday, I will present the formal modeling and analysis that lead to the new branching mechanism the Army adopted both for USMA and ROTC, starting with the class of 2021. So I think I'm doing a little bit better with time today. The time will not be as tight as it was yesterday. If there are some questions, I could take them. I don't know if there are any questions.
We do not have any questions as of now in the chat, so we could continue with
So,
the talk. Yeah.
The audience can write their questions if there are any, and we'll have I should have an opportunity to respond to them, because this particular talk is shorter than the other two talks. So here's the model. I is a set of cadets, each in need of at most one position at a branch. T is the set of possible contractual terms to acquire a position. There are two elements in the T. They are totally ordered. T naught is the base price, and T plus is the increased price. It is not difficult to extend this model to allow for multiple prices, but because the actual reform happened, in this particular way, and because I will give, some also, simulations with actual data, let's stick to the actual model, which is actually implemented, rather than a theoretical extension, which could be implemented for a wider class of problems. Let B be the set of branches. QB is the number of positions at branch B, and QBF is the maximum number that can be awarded at the increased price T plus. There are QFB of these positions, which can be obtained at the increased price, and those units I will refer to as flexible price units. They are not increased price units, they are flexible price units, because you can award them at the increased price, but you can also award them at the base price. By the way, I am using the notion of the terminology for that's adequate for the Army, but the model is more general. So here I can be any set of individuals, and T could be other type of terms. It could be actual cost, or it can be any costly action an individual can take to increase the chances that they receive a unit. Okay, so the model is not just related to the Army. And indeed, I will give some other applications of the model towards the end. Cadet preferences are basically strict preferences over branch price pairs plus remaining unmatched. The assumption is for any cadet I and branch B, receiving the branch with the cheap term is strictly preferred to receiving it expensive, which is very natural assumption, obviously. And Q is the resulting set of cadet preferences. In addition to cadet preferences, there are branch baseline priorities. For branch B, we call this is denoted as pi B. It is a strict ranking of all cadets. And in the Army, it used to be based on this order of merit list, but it could depend on other factors too. It doesn't matter for our purposes. Pi, capital Pi, is the set of branch baseline priorities. Okay, so this next slide is very important for our analysis and also for the model. And it is the first element that starts differentiating some of our analytical work from earlier literature. So given a baseline price priority pi B, a price responsiveness policy omega B plus is the following mathematical object. For any given branch B and baseline priority pi B, it is a strict ranking of cadet price pairs with the following two properties. So now basically you are not ranking cadets, but rather cadets together with prices. Okay. So first of all, this ranking should be exactly same as the baseline priority if you fix the price. So if you don't give a cadet higher priority over another compared to baseline priority unless one is paying more than the other one. Okay, so basically you are altering the baseline priority only if there is a different price. Otherwise, there is no reason to alter the baseline priority. And the second property is a price increase can only increase your claims. It cannot possibly decrease your claims. Okay, so basically this price responsiveness policy covers every possible way you might want that increased price may give you some bump. It could be a huge bump. It could be a more modest bump. Okay. So for the Army application, we will also call this mathematical object the Brazzo policy. Pi omega B plus is the set of price responsiveness policies, and it identifies the priority upgrade gain for the flexible price positions by paying the increased cost. So basically, this mathematical object is very similar to our concepts of marginal rate of substitution. How does willingness to increase the price affect you in the ranking of cadets? And in the past, Army allowed it to be lexicographic. Anybody who is willing to pay the increased price was put at the top of the queue compared to those who hasn't. But in the last several years, Army, because they started getting additional input from the branches, where they started having their own priority rankings, they didn't want cadets who are willing to increase their they didn't want cadets who are willing to pay the added price to get higher priority if they were coming from a very low bucket, for instance. Okay, so in a way, this price responsiveness policy or Brasso policy allows for all these possible policies. What are some of the examples of price responsiveness policies? We can have ultimate price responsiveness policy, where the increased price grants any individual higher priority over individuals who pay the base price. And this is used at USMA for class of 2006 to 2019. You can have tiered price responsiveness policies. This is a rather large class. And indeed, ultimate price responsiveness policy is a very special element of that class. Here, you partition individuals into tiers within the baseline priority order. Priority upgrade due to increased price is a function of the tier. So for instance, you do something of the following sort. You divide the base priority ranking into 5 parts in a continuous way. Okay, top 5th, next 5th, so on so forth. And then maybe you allow everybody to jump ahead of their own tier, or they can jump ahead of their own tier plus the next tier, for instance. It doesn't need to happen within the tier, but I get ahead of somebody else if and only if I get ahead of anybody also in that same tier where I am willing to pay the increased price and they aren't. Okay, so this is a large class. And 2 distinct versions are used at USMA in the last 2 years. You can also have very different type of price responsiveness policies. For example, it's not uncommon for the baseline priority order to be determined with a scoring rule, just as it is in India in the reservation system, for instance, right? And it's possible that increased price grants a fixed boost to total score. So you just receive some additional score when you are willing to pay the increased price. So it basically increases your score. Interestingly, in the past, this scoring-based price responsiveness policy is used in various Chinese cities for about 2 decades, I think, for the public high school admissions under part of a ZX policy. I will talk about that also at the end. I see one question. Maybe this might be a good time to take the question. If do I need to read it, or so how do we do this?
The question that if you could indicate elements of relevance of the study for other countries and particularly India, if there could be some indication of the study about applications, basically. So,
okay.
Yes.
So
maybe this
at
can
the
be
end of that, that's a great question. And incidentally, there is a paper by there's a great paper by Orhan Aygün and Berhan Turhan on dynamic reserves, and their application is in India in terms of affirmative action. And indeed, there was a question about that by Berhan Turhan, I believe, which I couldn't respond yesterday due to lack of time. And I was hoping to be able to discuss that. And indeed, their model is closely related. Their model on dynamic reserves is closely related to what we are doing here. And I will tell exactly how it is related. Okay. Now, what they propose is the following in relation to India. So they argue that in India, there is a stigma associated with reservation system, in the sense that individual students, for instance, prefer receiving an open seat to a vertical reserve seat. And as a result, the increase, in a way, receiving a position through the reserves it is similar to receiving a branch at increased price. So the price that they see is, or they conceptualize as the stigma cost. Okay, and they make suggestions about that. And in particular, they say, okay, because an individual prefers an open seat to the reserved seat, they should rank those pairs, and they make some suggestions. Their model is great, but the application for India is not so, as far as I can tell, for the following reason. The law in India specifies clearly who should get the open seat and who should get the reserved seat. So in particular, in the case of vertical reservations, that's already less of an issue because, I discussed that in detail yesterday. And if you are able to get the position without the reserve under the vertical VR policy, vertical reservation policy, you are already supposed to get the open version. That is the defining characteristics of vertical reservations. But if we are talking about horizontal reservations, you cannot just say, I don't want to get the woman position, because these positions are horizontal reservations, and they have to count towards the reserve by the law. So basically, this application, in a way, the model kind of conflicts with some of the key landmark Supreme Court cases in India. However, there can be other applications. You can take any priority-based resource allocation problem, and there can be other sorts of costly actions for which you can simply upgrade your priority at a fraction of positions. Okay, so I hope that gives a bit of a sense of how these ideas may or may not be relevant for India. And also, I wanted to use this opportunity to clarify, to respond to one of the questions that I wasn't able to respond because the time was over. Okay, so should I continue, or am I taking additional questions?
We have one more question. So,
okay.
What particular insights on factors influencing willingness to pay and the individual payoffs can be universalized or extended to other situations? And what are the conditions under which this can happen? Do these assumptions break down in real life situations?
So this paper explicitly models what is going on in the army exactly as it is. And indeed, it is implemented now in the army. So at least in our army application, it doesn't break. However, I will give another example in China, for instance. So think about, deferred acceptance algorithm, about 20 years ago, 2 decades ago, I formulated the school choice problem first with Michel Balinski in the context of Turkish college admissions, and then with Attila Abdülkadiroglu in the context of, more general, including US, and, proposing the deferred acceptance algorithm as one of two possibilities in school choice environments. And first, change the system in Boston and New York, and subsequently, now this idea is used, I believe, in about 40 countries, right? So that version of the model is already used. The model that I'm talking here is a generalization of this model, a very natural generalization of this model, where you can affect your priorities with a costly action in a fraction of the seats. For example, in China, it happened in the following way. They reserved some of the positions at school admissions for paying students who are willing to pay increased tuition, okay? And what that did is, it didn't give students absolute priority when they did that, but it increased their scores. So they were able to increase their scores with a higher tuition. So this is another real-life application. The model, I believe, is very natural because priority-based allocation itself is a very natural model. It is very widely used. I think it is very normal to have a generalization of this model where now you want to just give a little bit more of a flexibility for the priorities, but not in all units, a fraction of them with a costly action. Okay, so let me proceed. These are great questions. Thank you very much. And one thing that I want to emphasize is an important aspect of this research program, and my focus is, and that was also the case yesterday, there are no hidden assumptions or something in these models, and they are not only in principle that they could influence real life applications, they are actually now used in real life applications. They actually did inform applications. In the case of India, the courts themselves came to the same conclusions that we did, but they are following our suggestions basically. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe they might have read our work because we published some op-eds and we circulated those ideas, but the defining characteristics of this research program is the very strong link between the actual application and the theoretical analysis. So let me go back to the model. A contract is basically made of an individual, a branch, and the term of their arrangement, okay? And the interpretation is simply, this is a position for cadet I of X at branch BX at price TX when I talk about contract X, okay? Calligraphic X is the set of all contracts. Calligraphic X of I is the set of contracts that involve cadet I, and calligraphic XP is the set of contracts that involve branch B. What is an allocation? An allocation is simply a set of contracts X such that no individual can appear in more than one contract. You can get only one match, at most one match. No branch can appear in more positions than its capacity. And of these positions, no more than QFB can be at the increased price. So this is the capacity for the flexible price positions. That is the upper cap on the number of expensive positions that you can give. Okay, so that is basically description of feasibility constraints in this framework. And calligraphic A is the set of allocations. For a given allocation X and cadet I, the assignment Xi of cadet I under allocation X is defined as follows. If it is the case that the contract IBT is in X, then cadet I's assignment is branch price pair BT. And if it is the case that in all these contracts, I does not appear at all, then the cadet's assignment is simply empty set, nothing. Cadet I is unmatched if you don't actually have any contract with the name of that cadet among the in allocation X. In other words, if Xi is equal to empty set. What is a mechanism then? A mechanism is what it always is in mechanism design literature. It's a strategy space Si for each cadet I, along with an outcome function that maps the strategy space to allocations. Okay, and S will be the Cartesian product of individual SIs. A mechanism is a direct mechanism if the strategy space is simply the class of preferences for each individuals. Okay, so a direct mechanism is a preference revelation mechanism. As it is customary, we will denote a direct mechanism with its outcome function only. I will not indicate the strategy space. Why? Well, because it's always the same thing. It's always Q, which is the set of preference of individuals over branch price pairs. Just as yesterday, our approach is axiomatic. We formulate Army's policy objectives as technical axioms and characterize the unique direct mechanism that satisfies all these axioms. All but one of our axioms are defined both for allocations and also for mechanisms. In those cases, a mechanism satisfies the axiom if its outcome satisfies the axiom for all strategy profiles. I think that there might be another question.
Yes, we have one more question. So how will the model look like in a structure where the cadets don't explicitly declare the order of their preferences? So basically assuming that where we have a system, decentralized structure where the cadets apply one application for each different position instead of having a single application which contains the ordered preferences. So how will the model look like in a structure like this?
I mean, the question is not entirely clear to me. Is the question whether there can be a decentralized market for branches? I mean, once you go to a decentralized version of the model and cadets go to branches, they bargain, they say things like, I'm willing to pay 5 more years, 10 more years, who knows how this model can work. Now, what I can tell is, instead of implementing this mechanism as a one-shot preference evaluation mechanism, one can have an auction version of this model. And indeed, we are working on a version like that because the number of contracts for cadets might be too much. And one can study the properties of these models. But beyond that, I would rather not speculate on, how the model changes if I make more dramatic changes in the process. Now, I think this is an excellent question for also to make the following point, which is also related to the previous point I tried to make in relation to Eigen and Turhan's model in relation to affirmative action and affirmative action with stigma, where they proposed, why don't you determine whether an individual gets a reserve seat or regular seat based on their preferences. In their case, the reason was, well, the law doesn't allow for that. The law doesn't, the law is very clear on, you guys have this, Mandel Commission, which was there, like there's a huge, bargaining process between different parts of the community for decades, and Indra Sawhney formulates that. So yeah, sure, as an academic, I can go there, well, I have this economist idea of, using the preference in this particular way. You can go there and make that suggestion, but it is unlikely to make a real effect because it doesn't consider the laws, and the laws didn't appear from randomly. I mean, they capture a long process. So in that sense, in that paper, our starting point was the laws. I'm trying to help policymakers to achieve what they are trying to achieve, and that requires good modeling and understanding what is it that they are trying to do without making really wild changes in the model compared to what we see in real life. Here it's the same situation. If we go to the army and say, you know what, you should change the entire process, it should be decentralized, cadets should bargain with branches, and you should use this equilibrium, that equilibrium. Yeah, sure, we can do that. But at this point, the recommendation is not very likely to be taken by the policymaker, because the more you deviate from what is going on, the more you are likely to, make some assumptions which are dramatically false, or which basically simply detaches from real life. So typically, what we try to do is we try to get the maximum benefit by interfering the system in a minimal way. Okay. So thank you for this question. I think it gives me good opportunity to also elaborate on the general philosophy of this research program. And I believe the reason I've been fortunate, with not only this Army's application, but with all these school choice applications, kidney exchange, with pandemic rationing that we'll talk about yesterday, and even with India's, Supreme Court cases, is I didn't try to impose my own ideas. I tried to see what is it that policymakers are trying to do? What is it that people are trying to do? They are typically good at formulating principles, but not the mechanisms that implements the principles. So typically, people in other fields or policymakers are not aware that there is a difference between these principles and the mechanisms that implement them, right? And in a way, it is that particular gap we are trying to fill. So let me proceed with the axioms. An allocation X satisfies individual rationality if for any individual I, you always assign them an acceptable outcome. Individuals cannot receive unacceptable outcomes. An allocation X satisfies non-wastefulness if at any branch B and for any cadet I, if you do not fill all the positions at the branch, and if the cadet is unmatched, it better be the case that the branch is unacceptable for the cadet, even at the cheap price, for otherwise there will be a clear waste. An allocation X has no priority reversals if for any two cadets I and J and branch B, if it is the case that cadet J receives branch B and cadet I strictly prefers J's package to his package, okay? So basically, I want what J received, right? Well, it better be the case that J has higher baseline priority than I do, for otherwise, there is a priority reversal, right? What we are both willing to pay the same price. I have higher priority. How come he is receiving it and I'm not receiving it if this property fails? Okay. We next present two auxiliary definitions that highlight the intuition for our next axiom. Now, these concepts and the next axiom is related to the previous axiom. Now, the previous axiom is doing the following. I want somebody else's branch exactly in the same conditions, meaning with the same price, right? And this is a relatively more straightforward exercise. I want exactly what you have given to that other person. Now, I will formulate the following exercise. I want to get somebody else's branch at a different price. If he is getting it at the cheap price, I'm willing to give the expensive price for the same branch, or the other way around. When would these objections be legitimate in this model? The next two definitions will formulate those. Given an allocation X and a cadet I who is receiving his branch at the increased price, another cadet J, this is supposed to be J in I set minus I, okay? So another cadet J has a legitimate claim for a price-reduced version of cadet I's assignment Xi, okay? So basically, you receive it expensive. Not only I want the same branch, I want it cheap. Okay. Well, this is a lot to ask for, right? So there can be, first of all, for this request to be legitimate, first of all, I gotta prefer this as Cadet J to what I'm already receiving, because maybe it's legitimate, but it will not be a claim. You know, I will not want to get it if it is worse than what I'm already getting. And secondly, it should be the case that my cheap contract needs to have higher priority than other person's expensive contract. Remember, the Army, for instance, didn't want the lowest bucket cadets to get priority over, say, higher priority, higher bucket cadets, just because they are willing to pay the increased price. So my claim will only be legitimate if that was broken. Okay. Here, Cadet J's claim for a position at branch BXI at the base price T0 is legitimate because the price responsiveness policy does not overturn her higher claim for a position at branch BXI in favor of Cadet I, even when Cadet I pays the increased price. The next one is the other way around. Given an allocation X and a Cadet I with T, who is paying the cheap price, a Cadet J, another Cadet J, has a legitimate claim for a price increased version of Cadet I's assignment XI if, so now I'm telling, well, I'm willing to pay more for the position that, for the branch that other cadet received. For this to be legitimate claim, first I gotta want it, meaning this package is preferred to what I'm already receiving. Otherwise, I will not make that claim. Second, the price responsiveness policy should actually give me a high enough jump so that my expensive contract has higher priority than the other person's cheap contract that I'm objecting. There is one additional condition. Now, when I was trying to get an expensive object cheap, feasibility is never an issue because you can always decrease the price and this is always feasible. Why? Well, because there is a cap on the number of expensive units, not on the number of cheaper units, base price units. Okay. So basically, the additional condition here is if indeed you remove that other cadet's cheap contract and instead include my expensive contract, this better be feasible, right? It is possible that the cap for the expensive units is already reached and it's no longer possible to award additional units at the increased price. Okay. So we are ready to present the key axiom which differentiates our analytical results from earlier results in the literature. An allocation X satisfies enforcement of the price responsiveness policy if no cadet J has a legitimate claim for either a price reduced version or a price increased version of the assignment of another cadet I. Okay. So basically here, what is going on is this axiom is very similar in spirit to no priority reversals, but here the objects are for exactly the same package. Whereas under the enforcement of the price responsiveness axiom, the comparison is between different packages. Give me what he is getting cheaper, or give me what he is getting with the increased price. Our last axiom is a highly sought after incentive compatibility property defined for direct mechanisms only, and it is strategic proofness. And it simply means I should never receive a worse assignment simply because I'm revealing my true preferences. In other words, truth telling should be a weakly dominant strategy. Okay, so now what I'll do is I will introduce a mechanism, and it turns out this mechanism will satisfy these properties. It's called dual price cumulative offer mechanism, DPCO. It is a direct mechanism based on the seminal cumulative offer procedure by Hatfield and Milgram 2005, together with the specific choice rule for each branch. So what we will, the mechanism is not the cumulative offer mechanism, because cumulative offer mechanism comes with any choice rule, whereas this mechanism comes with a specific choice rule. If you wish, it is a refinement, strict refinement of cumulative offer mechanism. So what is the dual price choice rule? A choice rule for a branch picks a subset of contracts from any set of contracts. Given a branch B and a set of contracts X, select up to QB contracts. QB is the capacity of branch B, with distinct cadets in 2 steps as follows. Basically, in step 1, for the base price positions, exclusively select base price contracts with the highest baseline priority cadets. So basically, first only look at baseline priority and don't even consider expensive contracts. Only pick from cheaper contracts and use cadets priority for those. And in step 2, for the flexible price positions, select the highest priority remaining contracts, whether they have the cheaper price or the expensive price, based on the price responsiveness policy. So for the first, for the base price positions, you use the base priority. For the flexible price positions, you use the price responsiveness policy, and you also do this in a particular sequence. Okay, so for the dual price cumulative offer mechanism, fix any linear of cadets, any linear order of cadets. For example, you can pick the order of merit list. The outcome will not depend on this order, but I will use it to describe the mechanism. The outcome will be identical no matter what linear order you pick. At any step L of the procedure, the highest OML cadet IL, who currently has no contract on hold, offers his most preferred previously unrejected contract XL to the branch of the contract BXL, and considering all offers capital XL, it has received up to and including step L, hence the cumulative offer terminology. Branch BXL holds the contracts in the choice rule that we just defined in the previous slide and rejects all others. The procedure terminates when either no cadet remains with an acceptable contract that has not been rejected, or when no contract is rejected, all the contracts on hold in the final step are finalized. And our main result is, in this paper, fix a profile of baseline priority orders and profile of price responsiveness policies. A direct mechanism satisfies our 5 axioms if and only if it is the dual price cumulative offer mechanism. Okay, there is only one mechanism which satisfies these properties. So what is special about this result is the following. Prior to our analysis, Hirata and Kasuya 2017 and Hatfield and Commoners, Hatfield, Commoners and Westcomb forthcoming RES paper presented earlier characterizations of the cumulative offer mechanism, not a refinement, but cumulative offer mechanism. Fundamentally different than our analysis, however, in their models, each institution is exogenously endowed with a given choice rule that satisfies various technical conditions in these papers. Okay, so basically, these models start with the matching with contracts model, and they assume that, you know, each institution has a given choice rule. Okay, in our characterization, in contrast, the dual price choice rule is completely endogenous to the Army's policy objectives. We didn't endow the Army with a choice rule. Indeed, I didn't need to study this paper as an application of matching with contracts model. I could have directly introduced the mechanism without getting into that model. Okay, so however, the model, and in particular the mechanism, the key mechanism, emerges indigenously given the Army's policy objectives. So from a theoretical perspective, our main theorem is the first joint characterization of the cumulative offer mechanism together with a specific choice rule. So in a way, we are doing the design for the mechanism part and also the priority part of the allocation problem. And from a practical perspective, it has been instrumental in the joint design of Army's new allocation mechanism together with its priority system. As I mentioned and emphasized, the very concept of a choice rule is merely used in our model to describe the dual price cumulative offer mechanism. Not only our axioms do not rely on any structure or functional form of potential branch choice rules, even the existence of a well-defined choice rule for any given branch is not assumed in our analysis. Instead, the dual price choice rule emerges from our analysis in tandem with the cumulative offer mechanism as a collective implication of our 5 axiom. This is why our result is a characterization of a refinement of the cumulative offer mechanism rather than another characterization of the cumulative offer mechanism itself. It is also very important to emphasize that, and this is very similar to the paper that I mentioned yesterday, that I presented yesterday, all our axioms reflect the Army's policy objectives, and none of them are imposed upon us as technical conditions for the sake of obtaining an axiomatic characterization. On the contrary, the very reason the Army has initiated collaboration with the 2 civilian co-authors of this paper is the design of a branching system which ideally satisfies all these axioms. As I have emphasized earlier in the presentation, starting with 2006, the Army's adjustments in its branching mechanisms to implement its BRASO policies have resulted in priority reversals along with incentive compatibility failures. In a manner of speaking, the effort to accommodate the enforcement of the price responsiveness policy axiom has resulted in an unintended consequence of the failure of two other key axioms. And essentially, we are brought in to fix those failures. As I mentioned, the problem, the model is fairly natural because priority-based allocation, priority-based indivisible goods allocation model itself is rather natural, the school choice model, and an extension where now you are allowing some of the positions to be allocated with an increased price or with some costly action. You know, there can be many, many natural applications of that, okay? And one direct application is given by Wang and Zhu, and it's about public high school admissions in China under their so-called ZX policy. The perfect fit is not the it's not that they invented our mechanism. They didn't. They used flawed mechanisms actually, but the model is a perfect fit. And with our theorem, there is only one mechanism that is reasonable in this environment. Okay, so in their model, and that's real life practice in China for about 2 decades, I think, a fraction of the seats are available with an increased tuition. So that's high school admissions. Baseline priorities are based on scores on centralized exam. The higher tuition contract increases the score by a fixed amount for the ZX eligible seats. Shanghai and Tianjin especially are perfect applications because both have a single ZX tuition level, making the application completely analogous to the Army's problem. So their problem is mathematically isomorphic to the Army's problem. In some cities, there were multiple tuition levels where higher tuition levels result in higher adjustments to student score. So there is value in the extension which allows for multiple prices, and this is a straightforward extension. This policy is discontinued after 2015 in China by ministry's order because of fairness considerations. People were uncomfortable that you can buy, you know, positions or increase your priority by paying more. Obviously, this policy help is more favorable to, you know, rich than poor. So there's another interesting application by Aygün and Turhan in their 2020 JET paper. Let's call this affirmative action with stigma. As I emphasized earlier, I don't agree with their interpretation of their results for India, because in India, you just cannot say who receives open position or the reserved position. It is dictated by the law. Okay, and the roots are very deep, as I discussed yesterday, but the model is interesting. And indeed, our model has direct policy implications. So let's think about their model without the specific application in India, because there is affirmative action, but there might not be any strict laws like you do in India, in many other places. So the model is natural in the following sense. A fraction of the seats at each school is give preferential treatment to affirmative action eligible students. For any given school, any affirmative action eligible student prefers receiving a seat without invoking the affirmative action privileges to receiving a seat with affirmative action. So here what is going on is the counterpart of serving longer in the army for a branch position here is receiving a position with affirmative action. Think of this as an application where maybe there are 100 positions and 30 are reserved for women. Okay? So 70 positions are base price, basically normal, and 30 positions give increased, give priority for women. When you design, and suppose these results are announced, so you know who receives the open positions and who receives the reserve positions for women. And suppose people say, oh, she received the woman position, she received the position because of affirmative action, and there is stigma, right? And nobody wants to be treated like that, right? So what do? On the one hand, you want to provide this opportunity to women, in particular for 30 positions. On the other hand, you don't want them to suffer from the stigma cost. Okay? What you can do is the following. Instead of labeling these 30 positions as woman positions, affirmative action positions, you can label them affirmative action available positions. Okay? So these positions are flexible. They will still give priority to women, but they can be assigned at the cheap price without stigma if those women didn't need affirmative action to receive those positions anyways. Okay? So in a way, you allow 30 positions to benefit from women affirmative action reserves, but only you needed to invoke that extra bump for 18 of these, not 12 of these. So when you announce the outcomes, you say, you know what? We made 30 positions available for affirmative action, but only 18 of them are used. So you announce 82 of the positions as normal assignment and only 18 of them as affirmative action positions. So this model is analogous to what we are doing, and there is a unique, reasonable choice rule in this particular case, which is the one that we mentioned. Okay, this is conceptually related to dynamic choice rules Aygün and Turhan are proposing, but they are proposing a class of choice rules, whereas based on our analysis, one of them actually satisfies the axioms that we formulated, and I don't know which axiom can be really given up in this framework. With Army data, we also did, some, simulations. So, for instance, one big issue was, is it a good idea to go to a preference revelation mechanism? Because if you don't, you are losing some information. Did cadets benefit from the richer strategy space? And indeed, they did. So basically what this shows is not everyone ranks the expensive version right after the cheap version. Indeed, this flexibility of saying my top choice is infantry at the cheap price without Brazzo. My second choice is aviation at the cheap price, and only third choice is infantry at the expensive price? Well, for the first choices, these 21 guys are like that. And this is the same thing for second choices, third choices, and so on and so forth. The Army also conducted some simulations to determine the parameters of the problem, like what percentage of the positions we want to make flexible price, or what kind of price responsiveness policy we want to use. Do we want to allow everybody to jump only within their own tier, or should we allow people to jump for other tiers as well? Okay, and they made their decisions based on these simulations. In conclusion, the Army considered the design a success and also adopted it for ROTC ahead of its scheduled time. The decision to use DPCO mechanism for ROTC was in part due to concerns that ROTC's previous branching mechanism generated dead zones that made priority reversals particularly visible, as I discussed in another paper in 2013. Army has also identified additional ways to utilize the cumulative offer mechanism. Our model and the dual price cumulative offer mechanism can be used in other applications where an agent can take a costly action in exchange for higher priority in a fraction of positions. On a broader level, our paper highlights the importance of theory in market design and illustrates the practical value of matching with contracts model. Without several fundamental contributions in pure theory, Army's reform would not happen. Well, I thank you. I think there are a few minutes to take additional questions.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the talk. I now open the floor for questions to the audience. If we have any questions, please.
There might be one additional question in the chat. I'm not sure.
No, I believe that is just a comment.
I see.
Okay, so I think we don't have any questions. So I would like to thank you for this talk. So I think we do have one hand raised. Yes.
Hi. So, again. So you said that this responsiveness axiom is related to the is quite similar to the priority reversal thing in spirit. But when you were describing your theorem, you have no priority reversal as well as this responsive axioms, included in the characterization. So how these two are different? Yeah.
Okay. So very good. It's a very extensive, very important distinction. Price responsiveness compares exactly the same bundles. You receive infantry with the regular cost, and I say, you know what? You got to give it to me, right? So with that, and this did cause trouble in the Army. This failed in the Army because of the broken mechanism, where you have higher priority than me. I receive it cheap, you receive it expensive, and then you come and say, how is it that Tayfun is receiving cheap when I'm receiving it expensive, when I'm the more successful cadet, right? That's what price responsiveness policy does. So there you are comparing apples and apples. Under the second axiom, the comparison is between apples and oranges, but there is an adequate way to do that. So now, suppose you receive a position expensive, I receive it. I want your position, but I want it cheap, actually. I don't want to serve 3 additional years. You got expensive, you got infantry with the additional commitment. I say, give it to me, but give it me cheap. Don't make me serve longer, right? Now, my position would be valid, actually, if, say, I'm in a bucket in the priority where you are not allowed to jump all the way in front of me, right? Army actually didn't want the cadets in the lowest bucket to jump ahead. So this objection is also valid. And then you can have the other way around type of objections, also potentially valid. Also think of it in the following way. Suppose, think about the Chinese application, and suppose the CX policy is giving you 10 additional points, okay? And suppose I'm 15 points lower than you, and because I'm a rich kid, I'm assigned to that high school. And then you come and say, look, he's paying higher tuition, but he is 15 points lower than me, not 10 points. He's not supposed to get ahead of me when the difference is so big, okay? So that is why, even though the axioms are conceptually related, mechanically they are very different. Is this clear? I think it is. And indeed, that axiom is really what differs analytically much of what we are doing from the earlier literature. And it is the first of its sort, actually. Now, interestingly, this happened naturally. It's not a condition that I invented. I'm the one who formulated mathematically, but the army itself invented this condition. Also, the Chinese policymakers invented themselves. Of course, they didn't know what to do with that. And in the case of army, they were able to implement this axiom, but they broke the other axioms, more straightforward axioms. And that's why, they partner with the civilian. As you can imagine, it is not a very, common thing for the army to replace its mechanism in collaboration with, let's say, random, outsiders.
We have one last question. So as you mentioned in the example for China, that it discontinued the policy due to its nature of favoring rich over the poor, wouldn't it also follow that if the model is applied anywhere in the education sector, so it would hold true for that as well?
Okay. So when I work on these problems, say India's affirmative action, my job is not saying, oh, these judges do not make sense. Why do you give lower provision to women compared to Dalits? Right? It is not up to me. So these decisions are results of, long discussions, and they represent society's views. It is the same thing for China. So it is not up to me to say, whether you can receive priority with money or not. That is not up to me. I certainly sympathize with the fairness considerations, and I work heavily on them. But my job, and the way I see my position, is I try to understand the norms of the society, policymakers, do not try to impose on my values. So I don't take, you got to sell everything, free markets, or I don't do the other way around as well. And society is usually, policymakers, they're usually good at formulating desirable properties, which we can formulate as formal axioms. What they typically fail with is the mechanism to implement these principles. So what I do is I understand what are the considerations by the society and find the ideal mechanism to satisfy them. If there is one, so incidentally, this worked perfectly in the last two the presentations, because the society's own desiderata yields a unique mechanism which is neither trivial nor was available to the policymakers, right? And that is exactly why some of these designs are taken very seriously by the policymakers, okay? But of course, we can certainly study the implications, fairness implications of some of these choices, for instance. You can do all kinds of comparative static analysis. So in a way, I don't want to impose my views, my principles on the design, but I want my design to be used by everybody, including policymakers, to give those decisions. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Professor, for a wonderful talk. And I also thank our audience, and I request them to join us in another 20 minutes from now at 8:30 p.m. for another talk by you, which is on fair allocation of vaccines, ventilators, and antiviral treatments. So thank you so much. And the talk would later also be followed by a breakout session where everyone can interact with Professor Sonmez individually. So I also invite all of you to join the breakout session as well. Thank you so much. See you in the next session.
Thank you. See you in a bit.
Hello, can you hear me, IT team? Hello?
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, that's good. That's sufficient. Hi, I am Uday Sinha. I am at the List
Hi.
Club Economics.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Tayfun Sonmez. Thank you for making this possible.
Yeah, it would have been better had it been in the physical space of the List School, but unfortunately due to pandemic.
Hopefully another time.
Yeah, we hope so.
It's been a long day for you guys.
Yeah, it is. It is really long day. And it is going up to almost midnight for us.
No, I know. I mean, it's
You had a
Don't be
sleep.
alone.
Yes.
Let me leave for just for another minute, and I'll be back.
Yeah, fine. Should we now start briefly? Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our participants around the world. I welcome you all to this plenary session of Winter School 2021 at the Delhi School of Economics, which is being organized in association with the Econometric Society. This is the third and final lecture of Professor Tayfun Sonmez. By now, all of you have a fair bit of idea about the importance of Professor Sonmez's work. As we are still in the pandemic, it is of immense interest to all of us to know how the scarce medical resources, such as vaccine, ventilators, and ICU beds to be allocated, and what should be the objective of such allocation mechanism. India followed a kind of priority system for vaccination with its indigenously manufactured 2 vaccines. We are just about halfway mark in terms of coverage so far. Your morning talk was very exciting, and it was clear that Indian judiciary needs to learn a lot from your work. Similarly, I guess Indian policymakers will learn something from the present session. Without much ado, I just hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and appreciate the opportunity. So let me go into full screen mode. My third lecture will be on pandemic medical rationing. And this work is actually very much inspired by the Indian reservation system. I had work on reserve systems prior to studying the Indian reservation system, but I gained my deepest insights, with the Indian application. So in a way, India's reservation system, indirectly influenced medical rationing in parts of the world. So this paper is joint work with Parag Pathak from MIT, Utku Unvar from Boston College, and Bhuman Yanmez also from Boston College. COVID-19 pandemic has spurred renewed interest in guidelines for allocating scarce medical resources. These guidelines cover a wide range of public health emergencies for scarce items such as ventilators, ICU beds, antivirals, vaccines, and so on. By and large, these guidelines in the field and scholarly literatures in bioethics and emergency healthcare restrict their attention to variants of a priority system as their allocation mechanism of consideration. So in this presentation, we argue that a priority system is too restrictive, presenting evidence on how decision makers who are restricted to existing guidelines often struggle to integrate or balance the desired ethical values. To increase the flexibility of the system, we propose a reserve system akin to India's reservation system. We develop a general theory of reserve system design, and we relate our analysis to current societal debates and report preliminary policy impact. COVID-19 pandemic has motivated policymakers to revisit existing or issue new guidelines on allocating medical resources. These guidelines appeal to various ethical principles, including saving the most lives, saving the most life years, the life cycle principle, which suggests that everybody should have an opportunity to go through all phases of life, instrumental value, which gives some advantage to personnel, people who can help others to live. Reciprocity is conceptually related, but it is society's way of saying thank you to people who contributed to the society for their past good deeds, and equal access is all about fairness. These principles can compete with each other. For example, equal access ignores patient age, while the life cycle principle explicitly considers it. Therefore, an allocation mechanism must implement the desired balance of ethical values. Now, for some of these ethical principles, only the individual attributes are relevant, and they may have a natural or well-established cardinal measure. For example, a very natural metric for life cycle principle is age. A potential metric for saving the most lives for the case of ventilator ICU allocation is a score called sequential organ failure assessment score, SOFA score. So the SOFA score numerically quantifies the number and severity of failed organs. Each of 6 organ groups, lungs, liver, brain, kidneys, blood clotting, and blood pressure, is assigned a score of 1 to 4, with higher scores for more severely failed organs. By and large, most pandemic allocation guidelines worldwide rely on versions of priority system to implement the desired balance of ethical values. For example, for the case of vaccine allocation, the leading mechanism is priority systems based on priority tiers. Whereas, at least for the US, for the ventilator ICU allocation, the leading system used to be priority point systems, typically based on, at some level, SOFA scores. Now, the SOFA score is considered a good proxy for mortality risk, although minority groups are questioning that assumption and challenging it, and they are arguing that the score is actually works better for some groups than others, and it's hurting them. So if the sole ethical value under consideration is the utilitarian goal of saving the most lives, a single principal point system based on SOFA scores may be a good choice for ventilator ICU allocation. I'm not saying it is good. I'm saying it may be good because I think this is there's some tension on this very point. But in general, if there are multiple ethical values as urged by the majority of experts, then a priority point system is just too restrictive to reach an ethically compelling balance between the desired values. It maps individual attributes to a numeric scale, and therefore it cannot even incorporate principles which lack a cardinal and monotonic representation, let alone aggregate them. For example, it cannot accommodate distributional objectives such as proportional representation of disadvantaged groups. During the very first phases of the COVID-19 pandemic, while recognizing the need to consider multiple ethical values, many states adopted a priority point system based on SOFA scores only. So here I'm talking about the very beginning of the crisis, where we started thinking about this problem, where in Italy there was need for rationing, ICU units, and in US it looked like there might be need for ventilator or ICU rationing as well. And indeed, these rationings did happen at various stages of the pandemic. Others have adopted multi-principal priority point systems to accommodate multiple ethical values. For ventilator allocation, the priority point system emerged as the mechanism of choice in the US, adopted in more than half of the states which announced their systems. Others simply haven't announced. So I don't know of any state which is using another system. And vast majority of these systems were adopted in haste after the COVID-19 pandemic. A priority system is restrictive because it allocates all units based on a single priority ranking, sometimes mapping individual attributes to a numeric scale. Some principles may not have a monotonic cardinal representation, and others may partially or fully depend on the group structure. Aggregation across ethical values also raises the question of what is called incommensurability in ethics. So that's basically comparing apples versus oranges, and it's not always ethically appealing to do that. We next illustrate some of the consequences of these shortcomings, focusing on recent debates on essential personnel priority for ventilator allocation, which was our initial motivation. Many argue that essential personnel, especially essential healthcare personnel, should receive priority under pandemic resource allocation systems. This view is also strongly endorsed by medical ethicists based on the backward-looking principle of reciprocity, the forward-looking principle of instrumental value, and also due to the good incentives it creates. For example, this leading study, Emmanuel et al., which is the starting point of our analysis actually, says, but giving them priority for ventilator may also discourage absenteeism. Otherwise, people in high-risk jobs may just, not show up for their jobs. In order to issue their guidelines in a timely manner at the outset of the COVID-19 crisis, some states remained vague about essential personnel priority, despite being precise on other details. For example, initially, Massachusetts recommended a priority point system that relies on rigorous clinical criteria, but it casually suggested heightened priority for essential personnel without clarifying what that would mean. The Pittsburgh guideline initially specified two tiebreakers, one based on age and the other based on essential personnel status. However, it was silent on how to use these tiebreakers. The vagueness in these cases sharply contrasts with widely accepted calls for clarity in pandemic resource allocation guidelines. So here are some, newspaper, stories, and actually, the first one is very interesting for the following reason. We circulated our paper, the very first version, in April 2020, like April 5th, actually. 2 days later, Massachusetts announced their guidelines. And if you look at the Boston Globe news, they say preference given to medical personnel. Preference given to preference personnel. So this is like headlines. We looked at the guidelines, and there is no such preference given. There is just a casual remark. But reporters picked that point. At that point, we suspected that much of the considerations we were having, like policymakers, medical ethicists, not knowing exactly how to design their systems, might also be happening at Massachusetts, and we actually reached them out, and it turned out to be correct. Okay, so basically, in some places there is ambiguity in the guidelines, and they want to consider certain principles, they just don't know how. Yet worse, states such as New York and Minnesota in the past had to give up on essential personnel priority largely due to concerns about extreme scenarios where no resources may remain for the rest of the society. For example, in the Minnesota minutes and guidelines, you have the following discussion. It's possible that they, meaning essential personnel, would use most, if not all, of the short supply of ventilators. Other groups systematically would be deprived access. Or in New York guidelines, the discussion was, it may mean that only healthcare workers obtain access to ventilators in certain communities. This approach may leave no ventilators for community members, including children. This alternative was unacceptable to the task force. So these actually observations were our initial motivation for making our proposal. Essentially what happened in the past is ethics community and healthcare community wanted to adopt a wider range of ethical principles, but the mechanisms they are used to in their framework didn't allow for a reasonable integration of these principles. And as a result, they gave up the principles. And here the issue is again very similar to what we see in India. Like, it is one thing formulating the principles, it is something completely different designing a mechanism to implement these principles. And it is not unreasonable to think that it is best to get some expertise from more technical fields and market design in particular, with the design of the mechanism part. So the bottom line is a limitation of an allocation mechanism designed to implement ethical values resulted in giving up some of these ethical values. Now, it is clear that many challenges of the priority system stem from its restriction of relying on a single priority ranking of patients to allocate each and every unit. Therefore, a remedy has to break this limiting feature. A reserve system, as you are very familiar in India, divides resources into multiple categories and allows for distinct criteria for allocation of units in different categories. These category-specific criteria reflect the balance of ethical values guiding allocation of units in the given category. What are some real-life applications of reserve systems? Reserve systems are typically used in environments where society could not come with a single objective function they want to maximize or single priority they want to follow. And instead, there are several competing values and they needed a compromise. So reserve system is a mechanism of compromises, basically. And this happened, for instance, for deceased donor kidney allocation in the US, like 10 years ago, all kidneys were allocated with the metric that valued fairness a lot. Some were concerned that this procedure is highly inefficient. Okay, and when they reformed the system, they divided the kidneys into two groups: higher quality kidneys and all other kidneys. And they used a metric that values efficiency a lot more for the highest quality 20% of the kidneys, and the more equity-based metric for the 80% of the kidneys. Assignment of slots for Boston and New York City marathons, H-1B visa allocation in the US, school choice, considering all kinds of distributional considerations. The most elaborate system is India's reservation system, of course, and college admissions in Brazil. But there are many other applications. Reserve systems, we didn't invent reserve systems, although I think we contributed into its understanding, what it does, what it means, how different versions differ in terms of distributional considerations, and so on. So a reserve system can be also thought about a categorized priority system. You are using different priorities for different categories. So the primitives of this model is the division of the total supply of resources into multiple categories. Then you have to determine the size of each category. And you got to pick a category-specific priority order of individuals for each category. In most applications, it is also necessary to specify what to do when an individual qualifies for a unit through multiple reserve categories. This is a big deal in India, right? So what do you do if I qualify for vertical reservations, open category, maybe also some horizontal reservations, even maybe multiple horizontal reservations? Like, which one do you use? Use up, and law specifies that, right? And indeed, all these court cases in India are about flawed implementation of these issues. So in general, the issue is about the following question: if I deserve a unit or qualify your unit through multiple reserve categories, which one do I receive? Since all units are identical, an individual does not care about the category through which she receives a unit. However, this choice influences the outcome for other individuals. So it has huge distributional implications. This last point is often misunderstood in real-life applications, resulting in unintended distributional consequences. For example, in Boston, we have shown that the city wanted to implement over and above reserve for neighborhood students, but mistakenly they implemented minimum guarantee reserves, de facto, losing like 90% of the benefit to the for the intended group. And H-1B visa allocation, for instance, for many years, the US institution in charge of allocation, the government institution, they went back and forth between various implementations due to logistical considerations, purely logistical considerations, without realizing the huge distributional impacts they have. And then Trump administration actually did realize this aspect, and they used this feature to change the outcome towards an outcome that is politically more acceptable for them. Here, I should also emphasize the following about India: the distinguishing the differentiation of vertical and horizontal reservations by the Supreme Court judges is extremely impressive. And as far as I know, it is unprecedented, actually, realizing that there can be different type of reserves, because prior to their formalization of these differences and our analysis later on, it doesn't look like too many groups were aware that reserves can be implemented in very different ways to different effects, and as a result, either unintended consequences were obtained or intended policies were actually lost. So therefore, we present the general theory of reserve systems, even more general the one in India, because at the end, the system in India all starts with a merit ranking, and you embed priority for various groups on top of these this merit ranking. Whereas there are reserve systems. Think about Germany, for instance. They would allocate part of the university seats based on your exam scores, part of them based on when you graduate and how long you waited, and some others based on high school scores. So they are not all coming from a single baseline ranking. Okay, so we will allow for that generality, because this generality is valuable for us, since we are trying to capture, obtaining different priorities for different ethical values, and they don't need to be coming from a single ranking. What we do is we formulate 3 intuitive axioms and examine their implications. We formulate a cutoff equilibrium solution concept, linking our axioms to real-life applications. We extend prior analysis of sequential reserve matching policies, which dominate real-life applications, and formulate the potential shortcoming of sequential reserve matching policies, and analyze smart reserve matching policies as a remedy. So this last part, I talked a little bit in the context of India, in the morning. So this is, in the distinction between non-overlapping horizontal reservations versus overlapping horizontal reservations. So I introduced the smart reserves for horizontal reservations. So this idea will be a generalization of that concept. Excuse me. So let's give the formal model. I is a set of patients, each in need of one unit. Q is the number of identical medical units in short supply. And even though I'm talking about patients and medical units, these resources doesn't need to be, medical resources. They could be H-1B visas to be allocated. They could be jobs in India. The analysis is very general, but in the interest of the application, I will refer individuals as patients and goods as medical units. Calligraphic C is the set of reserve categories, a concept we are very familiar in India. Although in our case, reserve categories will both take, in the case of India, traits is also part of this description. RC is the number of units subject to category C allocation criteria, such that the total between all categories is the total number of units. Pi C is the strict priority order of patients for units in category C. So here I pi C J means patient I has higher priority for category C units than patient J. I pi C empty set means patient I is eligible for category C. And empty set pi C means that patient I is ineligible for category C. A matching is a function which assigns each individual either to a category, to empty set. If you are assigned to empty set, it means you don't receive a unit. And if you are matched to C, it means you are receiving a unit from category C. Okay. Now, this is a very important modeling choice. Typically in this literature, the analysis focuses on the collective set of individuals you are choosing through choice rules, rather than who is receiving the good through what way. Okay. In our case, we need to give an additional structure. Actually, this should be very obvious to you in India because of the reservation system, because I cannot just say that this worker receives a position, because there are laws on whether that person should receive an open position or scheduled caste, a position reserved for scheduled caste, for instance. Okay, so the outcome has to describe that so that you can verify that the law is followed. So, and in medical ethics, you will also have a similar consideration. So, because of that, we are not working with a choice rule. We are working with a matching. We did something similar yesterday. We work with our choice rule was actually a collection of connected single category choice rules, which is kind of like a matching, right? So this is a very important modeling choice, because even though patients are indifferent between all units, their claims over units in different categories are potentially different. Now, our axioms are very basic because we don't have too much of a structure of the sort we did either for the army that we talked about today, or of the structure, of the kind of structure, detailed structure that is given by the court rulings in India, we will have a lot more basic axioms, okay? We'll say that a matching complies with eligibility requirements if patients only receive units from categories for which they are eligible. So this is similar to saying you cannot give scheduled cost units to general category people. A matching is non-wasteful if no unit from any category remains idle despite the presence of an eligible patient who remains unserved. And a matching respects priorities if no patient remains unserved while a unit from some category C is awarded to a lower category C priority patients. So these axioms correspond to our more basic axioms in the earlier presentations. For example, the paper on India, and very similar in spirit for the axioms for the army analysis as well, but they're more basic because we don't have very detailed additional requirements as we did either through court rulings or through Army's policies. Now, for this framework, we formulate the natural counterpart of the standard competitive equilibrium, okay? So a reserve system solution is very similar to market mechanism in some ways. For any category C, a cutoff FC is either an individual or empty set such that this individual should have at least as high priority as empty set. Think of this as the cutoff individual, okay? And so this mathematical object plays the same role as a non-negative price in this model. Now, given a cutoff vector for all categories, the budget set of a patient is all these categories for which the patient has at least as high priority as the cutoff individual, right? Then what is an equilibrium? A cutoff equilibrium is a cutoff vector matching pair, just like a price outcome pair in competitive equilibrium, such that for any patient I, her assignment should be in the budget, right? So you are picking from the budget, and moreover, you gotta be maximizing utility in that budget. What does it mean? Well, you are indifferent between all categories except you like receiving a good rather than not receiving it. It means unless your budget is empty set, you gotta be assigned some category, okay? So that corresponds to utility maximization. And the second condition is the market clearing condition. Unless you fill all the positions in a category, the cutoff individual should be, well, cutoff should be empty set, meaning the price should go to zero. Okay, so this is literally the counterpart of competitive equilibrium. A matching mu is a cutoff matching if it is supported by some cutoff vector f at the cutoff equilibrium f and mu. It is very widespread practice to describe the outcome of a reserve system through its cutoff equilibrium, often utilizing a metric that is used to construct the priority order at each category. For example, in India, outcome is defined by cutoff exam scores or cutoff merit scores for each category. In Chicago admissions to selective enrollment high schools, outcome defined by cutoff composite scores for merit-only seats and for each of the 4 socioeconomic tiers too. Or for US assignment of H-1B visas in the period 2005 to 2008, outcome defined by cutoff application arrival date for the general category and the advanced degree category, with ties broken with an even lottery within each category. So the left is just a very typical, cutoff announcement from India. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with this system, cutoff system. And the right one is also from Chicago. So cutoff is a very natural idea. Our first analytical result shows a very strong link between our 3 axioms and the cutoff equilibrium solution concept. So the first result is a matching satisfies our 3 axioms if and only if it is a cutoff matching. Now, there can be, typically there are several cutoff matchings, not just one. So suppose we actually have an allocation where we have an outcome which is a cutoff matching. So let's construct the cutoff price, cutoff vector from that. And suppose there are 3 open units, and the priority for open units is I1 has the top priority, I2 has the next priority, so on and so forth. Okay. Suppose there are also 3 units where you are giving priority for essential personnel. Okay, so these are the red units. So for these units, there's a different priority. In this case, you simply upgrade the priority of essential personnel, which are E1, E2, E3, and E4. These are the red individuals represented by red rings. Okay, so now let's pick a matching, an outcome. Okay, and I'm not explaining why, but this outcome actually satisfies all our 3 axioms. I will not go through showing that. It's not difficult to see. What I will do is I will construct the cutoff prices for this allocation. Okay. Now, an easy way to construct a price would be just pick the lowest priority individual who received an assignment in each category. That is indeed a price, but this is F upper bar. This is the highest possible cutoff price. Okay. What you could possibly do is, and what I'll do is I will illustrate that there can be additional prices. Now, observe that the open units, which depends on the unrestricted priority, are on the top, and the reserve units are at the bottom. So, so in particular, like this E1 is not unmatched. She is matched, just not with the open category, right? So let me put everybody match in both rows to make a point. So now you see that what I could do is I could push the cutoff price as much as to E3 for you, and as much as to I2 as far as the essential personnel priority. So I can push the prices. But what we'll do is we focus on the maximum cutoff vector of F upper bar because it is a natural interpretation in our framework, whereas the other ones are somewhat artificial. The maximum cutoff indicates the selectivity of a given category. The higher priority the cutoff individual is, the more competitive that particular category is. Okay, so this was finding cutoff vectors. Once we are given a cutoff matching. But how do we find the cutoff matching itself? And indeed, most of the time, you might not even care for the cutoff vector, but you're definitely interested in the cutoff matching. So how to find cutoff equilibrium matching? Now, there can be a wide range of the cutoff matchings, and you can implement reserve systems in many different ways. But I will start by focusing on one where categories are processed sequentially for a given sequence of categories. Not all reserve systems have to process categories sequentially. And indeed, when we defined meritorious horizontal rule yesterday with the smart reserves, I recommended against processing them sequentially if horizontally protected groups intersect, as they often do in India, right? However, in real life, in all the applications that I'm aware of, they are processed sequentially, okay? So it is important to understand this particular version of the problem where categories are processed sequentially. For that, I define the following mathematical object. An order of precedence specifies the processing sequence of categories. So basically, when I say C precedes C prime, it means category C units are to be allocated before category C prime units. And a sequential reserve matching works as follows. You fix a processing sequence of the categories, and following the sequence, you allocate units in each category C to the highest category C priority patients up to capacity. Okay, so this is similar to the illustrations yesterday. If you process open positions first and then reserved, this is the counterpart of vertical reservations in India. Individuals with higher priority are towards the left side. You have twice as many positions as individuals. Blue individuals are general category individuals. Red individuals are essential personnel reserve, which receive priority for the red units. So if you first fill the open units, the highest priority individuals from any category will receive, and then all essential personnel reserve will go to red individuals, essential personnel. So here, 60% of the allocation go to essential personnel, 40% go to general category individuals. Okay. What if you do the other way around? You first process reserve, then open. Well, that's the counterpart of horizontal reservations. When you do that, the essential personnel units goes to higher priority essential personnel. Now you have to allocate open units, but when you do that, for a while, you'll not give any open unit to essential personnel because the highest score essential personnel are already served, right? Only when the score is, when you reach the same point, then you will start allocating open units, and then it will be 50-50 here. And the overall allocation is also 50-50. This is the minimum guarantee policy. And indeed, if you didn't have any reserve system at all, you would still allocate 50-50, right? So minimum guarantee reserve or horizontal reservations might not make a difference at all. So this is very different than vertical reservation. So the example shows that there may be several cutoff matchings. The processing sequence of categories is very important, and reserves may sometimes be redundant. And the first proposition is the earlier a category is processed, the more selective it becomes. Okay. Now, I will consider a version of the problem, also very common in real life applications, such as the system in India. Suppose there is a common baseline ranking, like the merit score in India. Okay. Before this, we were not making any assumption about the structure of priorities in individual categories. They could be completely unrelated to each other. Here, they will be related, and they will be related in a very particular way, similar to the system in India. There is an unreserved category U with the baseline priority order pi U. Any other category C provides preferential treatment to a beneficiary group IC. Okay, so these are like scheduled caste, woman, so on and so forth. Pi C is for category C, the priority prioritizes beneficiaries of category C over other groups, and the baseline priority order is used to break ties internally within the two groups, just like in India. Now, these reserves can be hard reserves where eligibility is restricted to beneficiaries only, like having hard reserves for scheduled caste, general category, not being able to receive, scheduled caste units. Or they can be soft reserves where everyone is eligible. You can also have intermediate, scenarios. In some versions of the problem in India, for instance, sometimes, scheduled caste units might be given to scheduled tribes units might be scheduled caste, but not anyone else. This can change between the years. So you can have any combination of these stories. The set of general community patients is literally what general category is in India. Basically, those are those individuals are who are beneficiaries of the unreserved category only. Okay, so they're only they have. Well, I mean, in general, this model doesn't mean that general community patients are uneligible for reserve units. So that aspect differs from India, unless reserves are hard. Okay. So this is a fairly flexible model, fairly general model. And this next proposition is similar to the previous proposition. The previous proposition was saying the earlier a category is processed, the more selective it becomes. But in that model, we didn't have anything such as beneficiaries. Like, for instance, one category was looking at, when patients arrive. The other one is looking at their age. And a third one might be looking at their SOFA score. Okay, so it's not like there's a beneficiary group attached to each category. Okay, so the result was saying the earlier it is, the more selective that particular category becomes. Here, there are, for each category other than the open category, there is an attached set of individuals like in India. Okay, so now we can make a stronger statement, and here the statement is the earlier a preferential treatment category is processed, the worse it is for its beneficiaries set inclusion wise. Now, this result strictly holds for hard reserves. Okay, it doesn't always hold for soft reserves. However, provided that there are at most 5 categories and each patient is beneficiary of at most 1 preferential treatment category, it also holds for soft reserves too. Okay, so over and above reserve processing is when reserve category is processed after the open category. It provides stronger benefit, and it is best suited for situations that warrant an extra boost. Real-life examples of over and above implementation is public positions in India, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes. So these are vertical reservations. School choice in Chicago, where vertical reserve counterpart of vertical reservations were based on socioeconomic tiers, or post-2020 H-1B visa allocation in the US for advanced degree. Minimum guarantee implementation, on the other hand, is when reserve category processed prior to open category provides weaker benefit compared to over and above implementation, may provide no benefit at all if target minimum already reached in the absence of reserve, and it is best suited for situations that warrant a protective measure. And real-life examples of minimum guarantee implementation is horizontal reservations in India, school choice in Boston. They implemented minimum guarantee, although this was an accident. They intended over and above, right? So this is the kind of mistakes policymakers or implementers make, not knowing the distinction between the two policies, or not understanding that there can be several different types of reserve systems. And if they do not know how to implement them, okay? Also school choice in Chile, where there are 3 categories: low income, special needs, high achieving. They implement minimum guarantee. Okay, so now what I'll do is I will actually use 2 examples. The second one will be the same as the example that I used to advocate the smart reserves for overlapping horizontal reservations in India. Okay, so basically what I'll do is I will present some potential issues with this procedure of mechanically processing reserve categories, and I will advocate for smart reserve systems. Okay, as I did yesterday in the last part of my talk. Well, it was yesterday for me. It was this morning for many of you. So suppose we have hard reserves, and there is 1 open unit, 1 essential personnel reserve. Okay, and these are hard reserves. Because it's a hard reserve, only essential personnel is eligible for the essential personnel unit. And suppose their priority ranking is I1, I2. Okay, so in this environment, if you first process the open unit and then the reserve unit, what happens is open unit goes to the highest priority individual I1. And then basically what happens is once the red guy is already served, nobody is eligible for the essential personnel reserve because, you know, we had hard caps. Essentially, you just match I1 to open unit and that's it, which means there is an idle unit left. And this might be implausible. Okay. On the other hand, if we first allocated the reserve unit would go to essential personnel, and the open unit will now be received by I2. Okay, so this is a maximal match. Incidentally, this issue only happens with hard caps. But for instance, you can have this under vertical reservations, because under vertical reservations, you first process open and then reserved. And indeed, those units, some of, if you don't have enough people from scheduled cost, they might stay idle, right? And the law specifies that, unless you do this for 3 years, it should stay idle and carry it over to the next year. Okay, so basically, an idle unit may be just okay in some setups, but not in other setups like pandemic. I mean, you don't want to be keeping, COVID therapies right now, saving it for people who might get sick next year when there is a lot more therapies, right? It depends on the context. So what I'm trying to say is this objective of maximal match may be plausible in some environments, but not necessarily all environments. Another issue is valid even with soft reserves, and it is more interesting in my view, actually. And that example I have already given for the case of overlapping horizontal reservations. So now we have an open unit, we have a red reserve unit for essential personnel, and one blue reserve for disadvantage. The purple I2 is a disadvantage essential personnel. So that's our purple individual who is eligible for both for the red unit and the blue unit. Okay, and the red individual 3 is essential personnel, and the blue individual 4 is disadvantaged. Okay, and their merit ranking, for instance, the priority that you want to normally use is I1, I2, I3, I4. Okay, but these red reserve and blue reserve give people who are beneficiaries of these categories shifting I2 and I3 at the top for the red category, I2 and I4 for the blue category. Now, as we have seen yesterday, so this is exactly the same example. If you first process the red reserve, then blue reserve, then open units, the purple individual who is flexible, who could receive any of the units, receives the red unit. And then we have to allocate the blue unit, which goes to I4. And then we have to allocate the open unit, which goes to I1, which means you give units to top guy, second guy, and the lowest priority guy, right? Importantly here, I4, the lower priority I4 receives a unit at the expense of higher priority I3. Okay. Instead, what you could have done is you could have first allocated the disadvantage reserve and given this unit to I2, and then the essential personnel unit would be going to I3, and the open unit would go to I1, which would match the top three individuals, which is obviously more reasonable, right? So the point is, you want to be smart about how you utilize the flexibility of the second individual who can accommodate the two types of reserves, even though that person himself doesn't care or herself doesn't care, it affects people later on in the queue, and you want to use it in such a way that the outcome is as meritorious as possible, right? And that you cannot do if you fix the processing sequence of categories. So to avoid the efficiency loss that I have given, in the first example, I will add one additional axiom now. I will say that a matching is maximal in beneficiary assignment if it maximizes the total number of units awarded to target beneficiaries of categories. Okay. A simple observation is, together with non-wastefulness, maximality in beneficiary assignment implies Pareto efficiency. Now we introduce a class of smart reserve matching procedures as an alternative to fixed sequence procedures. And essentially, the idea will be as an extension of the meritorious horizontal choice rule I discussed yesterday or proposed yesterday for the more elaborate version of the problem in India with overlapping horizontal reservations. So the main idea is determining which agents are to be matched with some category in a greedy manner, following their baseline priorities while assuring maximality in beneficiary assignment. And this can be done with graph theory techniques. Regardless of those techniques, I'm being loose here, unlike yesterday where I was very precise with the sequence of everything. In particular, depending on when you process unreserved units, you can do a range of things with this kind of idea. Yesterday, we processed reserved units first and unreserved units at the end, right? But you don't always have to do that. We did it like that yesterday because overlapping reserves were an issue for horizontal reservations, but not for vertical reservations. Vertical, everybody is only member of one category in India. So that wasn't an issue. The possibility was somebody having multiple horizontal protections, okay? So for us, only one element of this class of mechanisms were reasonable. But in a general context, others may be. So if all unreserved units are processed at the end, this extreme case of our algorithm generates a minimum guarantee version of the smart reserve matching. And it simplifies to the meritorious horizontal choice rule in Sonmez and Yenmez, our forthcoming piece, where it's proposed for implementation of overlapping horizontal reservations in India. On the other hand, you can use the same idea for vertical reservations too. If all unreserved units are processed at the beginning, this other extreme of our algorithm generates the over and above version of the smart reserve matching. So suppose individuals could be members of multiple vertical categories. They can't in India, but in another setup they could be. Okay, so then there is, that version of the problem also has a smart procedure. Any smart reserve matching complies with eligibility requirements, is non-wasteful, respect priorities, and maximal in beneficiary assignment. So basically, in addition to 3 base axioms, this additional axiom is also satisfied. And the next theorem says the following. Let omega be any over and above smart reserve matching. Mu be any minimum guarantee smart reserve matching of the sort I discussed yesterday for India. And nu be any arbitrary matching that satisfies the 4 axioms. Okay. Then of all matchings that satisfy our 4 axioms, over and above smart matchings are the most selective, and minimum guarantee smart matchings are the least selective ones for the unreserved category. Okay, so that's what this theorem says. And effectively what it is saying is it intuitively, this concept of vertical versus horizontal reservation policies, they have actually these smart, more responsive reserve counterparts, actually mathematically well defined and well behaved. Okay, so here the most related literature is Hafalar and Yenmez and Yildirim introduced reserve systems to economic literature, and Ekonika and Yenmez gave the first characterization. We introduced sequential reserve matchings with Scott commoners in 2016, and introduced smart reserves with Mumin Yenmez in our forthcoming paper for India, in the paper that I described in my first lecture. The impact of reserve processing sequence is given in a number of papers, starting with our paper that illustrated this phenomenon in Boston. And then we observed that Chicago uses over and above representation. H-1B procedures actually went back and forth between those. And this last one is the paper that I discussed in my first lecture. And there are additional applications of reserve systems by Aygün and Bo, which is just published in AJ Micro. This is about Brazilian reserves and the concept of incentive compatibility, which is key. And one of the 2 key, topic of one of the 2 key failures in India. They're the ones conceptually developed that concept. And Aygün and Turhan also has 2 other papers, or at least 2 other papers on reserve systems. And Korea et al. Discusses the reserve system that is now designed and used in Chile. And their paper directly utilized this literature to actually use minimum guarantees reserve rather than over and above reserve. So they are familiar with this literature, so they actually use it. So this literature benefited many real-life applications in the field already. Okay, so now let me talk about the path between theory and practice. So back to storytelling, less formal part of our presentation. Shortly after COVID-19 is declared a pandemic, New England Journal of Medicine published what became to be a highly influential paper outlining the desired ethical principles for allocation of pandemic medical resources. Our first response was, shouldn't experts from analytical fields such as economists, operations searchers, and computer scientists also be part of these designs? And by now, you know my position and how I see my role, in these efforts. Together with Parag Pathak and Utku Inver, we were already working on a book chapter on general theory of reserve systems. Upon observing the limitations of the existing rationing systems, and especially the inability of New York State and Minnesota ventilator allocation committees to accommodate essential personnel priority due to these limitations, we knew the reserve system is the answer. India has gone through decades of commissions, which is later formulated in the Mandel Commission case, right? So what do you do when you are trying to reach a compromise. You reach a reserve system. Well, pandemic had a similar situation. Medical ethicists were trying to reach compromise between different ethical values, not between different segments of the society, although there is a bit of that too in the pandemic rationing. So we repurposed our book chapter and circulated the first version of this paper in April 2020. Okay. As I discussed before, 2 days after we circulate the first draft of our paper, Massachusetts announced its ventilator allocation guidelines, but something was not quite right. Even though the announced priority point system did not have any priority points for medical personnel status, the Boston Globe headline suggested otherwise. Okay, the culprit for this confusion was an informal referral to heightened priority for medical personnel. This observation made us believe that the committee in Massachusetts may have faced similar challenge to those faced earlier by committees in New York State and Minnesota. We reached out to Robert Trog, a member of the committee and a leading bioethicist who has co-authored another influential piece very early on in the pandemic called The Toughest Triage, Allocating Ventilators in a Pandemic, actually in the same issue Emanuel et al. Was published. Robert Trog immediately responded to our inquiry and proposed a collaboration, also including Govind Persad, who is one of the lead authors of the New England Journal of Medical piece that motivated our initial interest at the first place, and Douglas White, a professor of clinical care medicine, well known for his priority point system for ventilator allocation. Joining forces with Trog, Persad, and White, over the next several months, we engage in various outreach activities, me, Utku Ünver, and Parag Patak, to introduce the reserve system to bioethics and emergency care communities. Through these efforts, we introduced the reserve system to several groups and started collaborating with bioethicist Harold Schmidt, who was especially interested in utilizing it to mitigate disparities in healthcare access. Okay, so we introduced the concept with the name of categorized priority systems in one paper because our partners were a little bit worried that we might scare people if we use the word reserve. So initially, they kind of opted for categorized priority system. Although later on, many others started using the reserve system terminology. Okay. So the first concrete outcome of our collaboration was a design of the antiviral medicine allocation guideline at University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which was subsequently endorsed by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania throughout the state. So by the late summer of 2020, our focus has shifted from ventilator and antiviral rationing to the upcoming vaccine rollout because how to allocate vaccine became a big debate. Since the beginning of the pandemic, there has been a vigorous debate on equitable vaccine allocation. Until National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's announcement of its preliminary framework for equitable vaccine allocation in September 2020, these debates were purely focused on the structure of priority tiers under a presumed priority system. So what happened in the past was also happening in this context. For example, Melinda Gates in June 2020, she said the following: we care about this vaccine getting out equitably. The first people that need this vaccine are the 60 million healthcare workers around the world. They deserve to get it before anybody else. Then you start tiering. In the US, that would be Black people next, quite honestly, and many other people of color. They are having disproportionate effect from COVID-19. Okay, but there was this conflict again between very different point of views. Should race be a factor in allocation and not, especially under the priority system? Should you give priority to black people who are disproportionately affected, indigenous people, or socioeconomic the worst people? And there was this impasse again. Okay. In July 2020, Centers for Disease Control and NIH commissioned the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, NASEM, to formulate their recommendations on the equitable allocation of a COVID-19 vaccine. NASEM appointed a committee of distinguished experts. And in September 2020, a preliminary discussion draft of the framework for equitable allocation of COVID-19 vaccine is made public. So they suggested a tiered priority system again, but casually mentioned that equity is a cross-cutting consideration. So you should somehow consider equity. Okay. So this is kind of like what was going on in Massachusetts before. You have a system that you know how to design the priority system, but you want to integrate additional criteria, you just don't know how. But you are not able to ignore it because this was a big issue, equity like this. This was a time where, there were lots of demonstrations in US, right, for equity. Okay. Now, in September 2020, immediately following the NASEM discussion draft, comments from the public were solicited through a formal process. In his written and oral comments, UPenn bioethicist Harold Schmidt has inquired about the recommended mechanism to prioritize members of hard-hit communities, which was casually mentioned without explicit guidance. In preparation for this contingency and in collaboration with Harold Schmidt, weeks earlier, we circulated the working paper Parag Schmidt et al. 2020, illustrating how easily a traditional tiered priority system can be modified as a reserve system by building equity into the system through an index of social vulnerability. This precise formulation was brought to the attention of the committee as a possible mechanism to embed equity in their framework. In September 2020, in response to the NASEM discussion draft, Journal of American Medical Association published a viewpoint fairly prioritizing groups for access to COVID-19 vaccines by Persad, Peak, and Emmanuel, and endorsing our proposed reserve system in their conclusion. So Zeke Emmanuel and Govind Persad, they are the lead authors of the main reference which started our analysis. So they endorsed the reserve system. So basically they said dividing the initial vaccine allotment into priority access categories and using medical criteria to prioritize within each category is a promising approach. For instance, half of the initial allotment might be prioritized for frontline health workers, a quarter for people working or living in high-risk settings, and the remainder for others. Within each category, preference could be given to people with high-risk medical conditions. Such a categorized approach would be preferable to the tiered ordering previously used for influenza vaccines because it ensures that multiple priority groups will have initial access to vaccines. In October 2020, NASEM published their final version of their suggestion. So they published their framework for equitable allocation of COVID-19 vaccine based on the ethical values formulated in Emmanuel et al. And importantly, in their final framework, they formally recommended a 10% reserve for people from hard-hit areas. And they emphasized the committee does not propose an approach in which, within each phase, all vaccines is first given to people with high SVI areas. So basically, they're saying we are not suggesting a priority system because that is hotly debated. We are suggesting a compromise system. Rather, the committee proposes that SVI be used in two ways. First, as previously noted, a reserved 10% portion of the total federal allocation of COVID-19 vaccine may be reserved to target areas with high SVI, and so on and so forth. Okay. Shortly after the NASAM recommendation, Tennessee immediately adopted the reserve system and became the first state to adopt the reserve system for its vaccine rollout. But after Tennessee, we were very excited, and because typically impact doesn't come that early, it takes years and years, although with the India paper, it was also very surprising. It happened while we were writing the paper. So initially, only Tennessee responded. So what we did is, in part to illustrate policymakers how easily equity can be built into vaccine rollout through a reserve system, we co-hosted a symposium in collaboration with Ariadne Labs, Harvard Chan School of Public Health, and UPenn's Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy. The symposium not only helped us to better understand the needs, challenges, and perspectives of several jurisdictions, but it also directly contributed to two important developments. First, it provided our co-organizers from Ariadne Labs with a natural opportunity to bring the reserve system to the attention of the committee responsible for vaccine rollout in Massachusetts. And similarly, it provided our group, the three of us, Parag, me, and Utko, with an opportunity to bring the reserve system to the attention of California Surgeon General, Dr. Nadine Burka Harris. In a number of group meetings, we introduced the reserve system to Dr. Harris, and her team advocated for its adoption in California as an instrument to building equity in their upcoming vaccine rollout, and coached members of her team on the subtleties of the reserve system, like the overlapping categories, minimum guarantee, over and above implementation, the importance of not implementing the wrong policy. In December 2020, Massachusetts became the second state to adopt the reserve system for its vaccine rollout, where they adopted 20% over and above for high SVI group. In March 2021, California adopted a particularly ambitious reserve system for its vaccine rollout with reserve categories both for educators and hard-hit populations. Okay, so in the coming months, more than 15 states adopted reserve system utilizing various different versions. And while equity and social justice considerations have been the main driving force in most jurisdictions for the acceptance of the reserve system, it is not the only reason. For example, phase 1B of the vaccine rollout in Richmond, Virginia is a good example. Richmond's reserve system utilized category-specific priorities, which is an important feature absent under a priority system, also absent under the India's version of the problem, and that's why we needed a more general version of the problem. So vaccine rollout hasn't been the only application where our system was utilized. Our proposed reserve system has been gaining traction for allocation of medical resources other than vaccines as well. The Department of Public Health assembled a working group to advise on equitable allocation of COVID-19 therapies delivered to Massachusetts in the event of a shortage. A member of the working group, Dr. Emily Rubin from Mass General, inquired our group whether our proposed reserve system can be used for equitable allocation of COVID-19 monoclonal antibody therapies, and if so, how it can be operationalized in practice. Our group supported the working group with this reserve system design tailored to the specifications for Massachusetts announced policies and provided them with an Excel spreadsheet implementation of the system. In November 2020, Massachusetts adopted a reserve system for monoclonal antibody therapy allocation. So these are the details. Initially, it looked like actually they might use a very similar system to India, where you have both over and above and minimum guarantee within each category, but later on they went for the simpler version. So the framework in India is providing to be interesting and important for other purposes as well. Okay. Later on, just a few weeks ago, Rubin et al. Reports the successful deployment of the reserve system for allocation of scarce COVID-19 therapies in Massachusetts and how it increased access to socially vulnerable patients. So in the first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic, many societies were caught unprepared when they needed guidelines for possible ventilator rationing. At present, there is worldwide need for policies and mechanisms for equitable allocation of scarce medical resources. Poorly designed allocation mechanisms may damage the social contract between different segments of the society or between different societies of the world as a society. Widely accepted but potentially competing ethical values for pandemic resource allocation require a mechanism to implement the desired balance of values. Finding the right mechanism to honor these principles is therefore important for maintaining the social fabric. Because the mechanism is a tool to realize ethical values and not an end in itself, it should permit a wide range of options. The exclusion or inadequate balancing of certain ethical principles may do more harm than good. In a previous pandemic, the following quote was made in New York Times: maybe you end up saving more people, but at the end, you have got a society at war with itself. Some people are going to be told they don't matter enough. And you already see this actually for vaccine allocation in the world, right? The entire point is that some lives are worth less than others. When revising or modifying guidelines during or after the COVID-19 pandemic, a reserve system should be part of the arsenal, and it looks like it might be. Well, thank you very much. This concludes my last lecture, and I'll be delighted to take questions now and also in the breakout session. Thank you.
So, one or two questions, and as Professor Tayfun will be meeting in the breakout group, so you will have ample opportunity to ask questions there, for which a separate link has been sent to the registered participants. So one question, if possible.
Oh, I mean, absolutely.
Any question from the participants at the moment? It seems there is none. So let me take this opportunity to thank you very much, Professor Sonmez, for the wonderful talk. It shows how the theory can inform policy and the easiest way to implement with the help of simplest possible mechanism. And India has been a source of your motivations for making all these solutions. We would have liked you to host you at the Delhi School of Economics. Since it was not possible this time, I'm sure you would visit us someday. Given Absolutely. Your keen interest in Indian systems, we look forward to more of your research in solving complex problems pertaining to India. So thank you very much. And I am sure many people have registered for the breakout group and they will meet you again. Thank you, Professor Sonmez. With this, I'm just...
My absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you. With this, let us close this session, and a separate link will be there for the breakout participation. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, see you in 15 minutes.
Yes.
Bye.
Okay, bye. Now you can